Okay, everyone. This is week 9. We are doing crime deviance and how that relates to inequality. As a reminder, these these middle 3 sections of the course where we talk about inequality for 3 weeks. Then we talked about culture first for 3 weeks. Now we're talking about inequality for 3 weeks. And then next we'll talk about systems and organizations for 3 weeks. Each of the weeks we do, there's a little topic that's related to culture, inequality, and systems, but we could also look at each of these topics like crime in culture and in systems, right? We could look at the criminal justice system. When we did the week on families, we could look at families and culture or families and systems. When we do science, we could look at that and look at science and inequality and science as culture. So just kind of an explanation that it's not just that you have to look at crime through the view of inequality. You can also look at it through these other things, and similar to each week that we do. But today, as I said, we're going to talk about crime and how it relates to inequality. First, we're going to go through some midterm evaluations. After you all took the midterm, and at the end you evaluated the class, what you liked, what you didn't like, what could be improved. And I wanted to go through that with you just so you knew what students were appreciating and some things that we might talk about changing. So the parts of the class that students felt were most helpful were the people like the variety of learning materials, that there's various the weekly lectures like this, the detailed learning guides, the course structure, that there's a pattern to every week, that you know what to expect, that there's detailed directions on assignments, lots of helpful feedbacks, and that office hours are helpful and I engage with you on announcements and emails. Now, there were things that students requested that could be different. First, that they felt there was a lot of too much work in terms of reading materials and workload, and that sometimes the amount of the different kinds of assignments and due dates are confusing. Regarding the assignments, some people have asked for more quizzes in addition to the discussion board, reminders on the essays. A couple of people have asked for more information on assignments, especially the mini group projects, and that the group mates are not being responsive or helpful. The grading system, which we'll talk about in a second, and then professor engagement. Some people hoped that I would reach out more to individuals and check in, someone asked for more review sessions and Zoom meetups to share ideas verbally. So I wanted to go through a couple of these. It's hard to know about the workload in reading materials because on one hand, students like the variety, and then on the other hand, people want less. So if you like the variety, then I can't really reduce the learning materials, because that would mean that you would probably just be stuck with the chapter of the textbook every week and you wouldn't have the variety. I would suggest either learning by searching the internet, going to the library and asking for help, or coming to my office hours and talking about productive skimming for how to make sure you get what you need to and move on. No one yet has come and talked to me about the workload, so there's not much. I didn't know that this was going to be an issue, and no one has asked for help, but I guarantee you there are easy ways to work in college, and it will be very helpful for you to learn how to skim competently and quickly. I also wanted to make sure that you weren't just getting a introductory textbook and reading a chapter every week, because that is very dull, and it also doesn't prepare you for future classes, right? If I only gave you that text and then in your next course you have full-on academic articles, that will be a huge shift and will really jar you and won't prepare you for learning at that level. So hopefully, what I'm hoping for is that by having a intro textbook, some example articles that build on that textbook, plus some videos to help you figure out what that means, that it all kind of works together and prepares you for higher level activities in the future. I am happy to field individual like ideas on how to reduce the workload without reducing the variety and the preparation for future courses. About assignments, some people have asked for quizzes to help them make sure that they understand the discussion board. I wanted to clarify or at least suggest that at the back of the textbook every week there are quizzes that you could take. Because people are already saying there's too many different kinds of assignments and due dates, I am reluctant to give quizzes. It stresses students out more than I've found that it helps students. So if you're looking for something just to test your knowledge, I highly suggest using the textbook quizzes in the back. They're pretty good. Providing more reminders on essays. Every week I create that weekly outline at the beginning of each week's readings that say what is due that week. They might even have reminders for like 1 or 2 weeks ahead of time. So I'm guessing people are hoping that I would provide announcements. I will try to remember to do that. I have a lot on my plate, and I expect that you will read the syllabus and put, make a calendar of when things are due. I highly suggest putting it in your phone or on your computer calendar and put a reminder and set a reminder a week out from the due date of each one. So for example, there are 2 assignments due at the end of week 10. Put an assignment or a event in your calendar on not this Sunday, but next Sunday that says investigating sociology assignment number 3 due, remind me a week from Sunday. Mini group project number 4 due, remind me a week from Sunday, right? So that way you have something else helping you remind you. I feel uncomfortable being the person who is always reminding students. Plus, on a lot of these weekly check-ins, I do discuss and remind students what's going on. So I will consider it. That has been something I'm not inclined to do simply because I want you to take ownership of your class and because I have a very lax grading system. I feel like I've given up a lot for you to take control of your own class. Group mates are not being responsive. I've worked with a couple of you on this. Remember that you cannot do these group projects alone, and you have to do them in order to get higher than a D. So if you are confused or have questions or your teammates are not helping, I am happy to move you to a different group so that you can do it and be with a group that's working. But I should remind everyone who is not being responsive or helpful that you will not do well if you are not being involved. We'll skip the grading system. We'll go to that next. Professor engagement. For the review sessions and Zoom meetups, I was surprised at this because no one comes. I have this every week and no one shows up. I'm not sure what more review sessions you want since I do cover the material for the week. And no one explained what they meant by Zoom meetups or review sessions. I set up the mini group projects partly so that you have a group that you connect with and talk to so that you can share ideas verbally and you can have that discussion. And I would hope that you are using it for that and not just to do the group projects. I would highly suggest you reach out to other students and ask if anyone wants to meet up to talk about the class and review the material with each other. Also, no one has come into office hours to ask for help and talk about ideas verbally. So I'm a little confused on that simply because there hasn't been much requests for that until I've seen this, and no one comes to the opportunities I already provide. So please reach out to me if any of these are of interest to you and we can talk about them. Regarding reaching out more, I apologize that I haven't reached out individually. I usually do this. I have more than 150 students right now, so it's just been a little difficult. I will do my best to increase that before the end of the semester. Okay, for grading, someone asked if we could do like half points instead of zeros and ones. doesn't necessarily work in my grading system. So if you remember, I do competency grading rather than, instead of having you do all of the assignments, I give you a percentage, whether that's from 0% to 100% on each one, and then we average it out, and I decide which ones are more important and which ones are less important. That means that you could finish the class without having mastered anything, right? You could do fine, like okay, on every single assignment, but never really master any of the content, any of the skills. And you could walk away with this class not knowing much or not having improved much. And that is something I do not want to see in my courses. So I have shifted my grading to competency grading, where you have to show competency at different levels to get certain grades. So that way, even someone who is going away with a D still is competent on a lot of the material in the class. So I don't give half points because I am focused on you becoming competent, and it really doesn't make sense to be halfway competent. So I grade things on whether or not you demonstrate competency or you revise and resubmit. Those are really the grades. The problem is Blackboard doesn't have an option to give you any kind of grades besides numbers. And so you can so I've made it either 1 or 0, 1 being that you've demonstrated that competency, and 0 meaning you need to revise and resubmit. Demonstrate competency really kind of means that you have met around 85% of the objectives competently, that you've exceeded all the expectations and done even better, and you're really competent and you can be proud of that work. A revise and resubmit simply means that you still need some work. You need to practice your skills. You need to redefine the concepts. And you can always revise and resubmit. Another reason it doesn't make sense much to give half credit is because I give the opportunity for you to revise and resubmit everything. You can revise and resubmit any of your discussion posts that you've missed or have not gotten competency on. You can revise and resubmit your exams, your mini group projects, and your investigating sociology assignments. So I could give you a half point, but that doesn't increase your grade anymore, right? Because you have to, in order to meet any of these criteria, you have to demonstrate competency. And a half credit doesn't do that. You would still need to revise and resubmit. So there would be no fundamental difference between a 0 and a half point. So looking at this table, let's say, for example, you're looking for a C. You need to demonstrate competency on 14 out of 15 weeks of discussion posts, get at least a 75% average on the midterm and final, complete all of the mini group projects, and then finish one of the investigating sociology assignments competently. And if you do those things, you will get a C plus in the class. And you don't have to do any of the other assignments. You don't have to do the other 4 assignments that I assign. And so that you are walking away with a competently written and argued and demonstrated assignment that you can be proud of. And so if you didn't get competency on that, you will take it home, revise it, see my feedback. I give really detailed feedback, and revise it, resubmit it, to show that you are competent in that assignment. So that's how the grading section works. You can always just look at what items you have you have shown competency on, which ones you haven't. Come to this chart, see where you land on how well you're doing, and that will help you tell your grade. If you have ideas for how to avoid the 1s and 0s, yet still have this competency-based approach, I'm happy to hear it. I'm always revising and updating this. But so far, this has been the best practice for my students. Okay, so as always, a lot of people have conflict in what they want. So some students ask me to stop responding to other students' questions because it reduces, well, how can I answer that? Whereas a couple more people wanted me to be more engaged and answer more questions and respond to more posts. So I'm trying to keep a balance. Just remember, you can also add on to anything I submit. I am not the arbiter of all knowledge. You have many experiences that I have not. So you can even question me. You can add on thoughts. You can, just because I have responded to a student does not mean you cannot. I usually try to respond if there has been confusion, if there is a definitional or complex question that I am worried that other students will not know how to answer, and any questions that will just avoid confusion for the future. Otherwise, I do try to allow students to keep working on each other. Okay, please let me know if there's anything else I can do. I've only had a couple students come in one-on-one, so I'm not sure. It's harder for me to make these changes when I'm not sure exactly what people are asking for. So please reach out to me and let's set up a meeting and talk. I really liked reading these. What you students have talked about in order of how often they came up is most students loved learning about social control and socialization. Second was the matrix of domination. Third, showing that society influences our actions and decisions. A lot of people identified specific scholars that they do like Ida B. Wells and Du Bois and Marx. The idea of how society is like a religion and functions with culture and symbols. A couple of you just said all of it. Authority, and then concepts of race and ethnicity. Okay, so I'm glad that this is ringing a bell, or at least is interesting to you, and I hope that the rest of the course increases in how interesting it is. So let's get started with crime. So this is the first excerpt you read was from the New Jim Crow, and really what she is trying to describe is how did we get to a system where the US not only incarcerates humans at a rate higher than any other country, but that specifically targets Black Americans and Black American men. So the rate of incarceration for Black American men is about 4,300 people per 100,000 people. And that's higher than the average rate in the United States and Cuba and Russia and Brazil, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, right? In Italy, they only incarcerate 90 people per 100,000. So we have a massive incarceration question. And Michelle Alexander is a legal scholar who set out to answer why. And so in the section that you read, she argues that there is an early connection to the way we talk about crime in politics and policy and race. So in the 1950s, we start seeing a lot more civil rights agitation, specifically like the boycotts, the sit-ins, the protests, the riots, and Southern leaders at the time started using this rhetoric of law and order in order to say that the civil rights were disrupting the order of the society, and we needed to crack down and expel any movements beyond what is normal and what is orderly. A couple of them said it is dangerous to assume that individuals can just break whatever laws they seem unfit. Today, we know that it was very important for these direct action movements, for the civil disobedience. But at the time, they very much couched this in the language of law and order. And this continued to evolve with the idea that law and order meant the control and policing of racial minorities because they were the ones disrupting the social order. And so even though there was here and there explicit racialized crime rhetoric, really it morphed into as Black America won important legal victories, and we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it became less and less appropriate in the political mainstream to talk about Black communities negatively. It went into a disguised rhetoric that could hint at race without it being explicit. This really became a problem with Nixon's campaign, in which multiple people who have come out from the Nixon campaign have remarked about how his campaign specifically was focused on race without saying race. So one of his advisors said, Nixon emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. And the key to devise a system that recognizes this and talks about it while not appearing to do so. One of his special counsels to the president said that Nixon's campaign strategy was, "We'll always go after the racists." Subliminal appeal to the anti-black voter was always present in Nixon's statements and speeches. And Michelle Alexander and other scholars have found that by the 1960s, economic status was no longer the dividing factor between political parties and ideology, but it was racial animosity is what divided conservatives and liberals. During this time as well, there was this debate about what caused poverty. Conservative politicians and academics were saying that poverty was caused by culture and crime, that if minority communities that had a lot of poverty would simply be better. If they would simply work harder, if they simply move away from crime, then they wouldn't be poor. Whereas liberal academics and politicians were saying that poverty was caused by structural conditions, and poverty is what led to crime. Lyndon B. Johnson took this approach, and he started the War on Poverty to to help people in poverty have more economic stability and hopefully reduce crime. And it's important to note here that there was a huge amount of poverty that led into the 1960s because of deindustrialization and globalization. And she marks this in the chapter as well, that after the Civil War and during the Reconstruction era and right after, there was a massive amount of Black Americans who moved into cities, large cities where there were industrial plants and factories, and they could get really decent wage labor without an education because they had little education as enslaved or sharecropping families. So it was their way of entering the middle class, or at least the Black middle class. During deindustrialization, a lot of these plants closed, they moved into the suburbs, and the jobs that used to be in these large cities, especially in the inner cities, went away, and there wasn't any place for young Black men to get jobs. And so there was a huge poverty crisis, a huge unemployment crisis, which, as scholars now know, poverty does lead to crime. Poverty is a great predictor of crime, and crime can be explained by poverty in a large part. And so it's important to note that the structural conditions that determined poverty were recast as cultural problems rather than structural conditions. In the 1980s, this got even worse. So Reagan in 1982 declared a war on drugs. Now, this was an interesting moment because American polling said that only 2% of Americans really thought drugs was an issue, that it was a pressing issue. And today we think about the war on drugs as a war on crack cocaine. Crack cocaine hadn't even really appeared as a major problem until 1985. And so Reagan's war on drugs came before the crack era and was largely used as this rhetoric of racial animosity, this war on crime, this war on drugs, we need law and order. So this was another way to drum up racial animosity by white voters to scare them into voting for the Reagan campaign. And it created a slew of policy changes and moral panics that we still see today. So, for example, in the 1980s, we saw the push for the death penalty, mandatory minimums, evictions from public housing, the restrictions of applying for a student loan. And I would like to say that this was not just a Republican issue. After the Republicans started taking this really hard stance on war on drugs, the Democrats didn't want to look weak on crime, and so they also pushed for harsh sentences. The 1990s saw another explosion in prison populations, and Clinton did quite a few policy changes to really enforce drug policies. There were the three strikes you're out, moved to one strike you're out, meaning you could get life sentences with just one drug offense. He limited welfare for anyone with a felony drug offense. They shifted funds from public resources to prisons, and they had more restrictions on public resources. So the big takeaways is that racialized messages fueled the war on crime and the war on drugs. These were not simple, oh, there's rising crime, we need to address that. It was largely, we need to galvanize a population of voters, and the easiest way to do that was through racialized messages that stoked up racial fears. There was no evidence, and there still is not today, that non-white communities are any more criminal or higher drug users. And they increase the consequences of drug crimes that were specifically connected, at least in the public imagination, to communities of color. So as a list of the policy consequences from this era, we see budgets for drug enforcement increase. We see militarization and expansion of police powers. This also decreased budgets for the drug rehabilitation. It authorized evictions, eliminated federal benefits for drug offenders, banned them from food stamps and public housing, and it moved a lot of resources from public welfare to prisons and policing. And we see that this era and the consequences of incarceration really affect inequality. So remember, inequality is the unequal distribution of either resources, opportunities, and or rewards or outcomes. And in this chart, we see that whether your race and your experiences with incarceration really affect how you are able to gain wealth and progress in society. So in 2000, those who were white and never incarcerated, on average, for young men, were expected to have a wealth of around 125,000. Whereas those who were Black and never incarcerated might see just under 24,000, and those Black folks who were incarcerated would barely see around $7,000 in wealth. So this was a really drastic effect on inequality from the 1980s to the 2000s, and it has increased as we'll talk about as we get into elite deviance. Some other examples of how we construct crimes and drugs racially. So race, looking at opioids on the left, we see that whites are more likely to use opioids, and yet they are less likely to be incarcerated for opioid use. Likewise, in cocaine, there were two different kinds of cocaine. There's crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Powder cocaine was more difficult to purchase. It was more expensive. And so crack cocaine was the method of cocaine that inner cities would use because it was cheaper. And so the mandatory prison sentences for crack cocaine is almost twice as much as the mandatory amount of prison sentence for powder cocaine. It still is today. And in fact, of crack use or cocaine users, 2/3 of them are white, yet the majority of sentences are on Black individuals. We could talk more about the opioid epidemic. I don't want to drag you down, but there is great research on how the way we frame the opioid epidemic rather than the crackdown or the war on crack really shows when something is seen as a white issue, it is addressed with public health and with rehabilitation. And when something is seen as a minority or Black and brown issue, it is seen as an issue of public safety and that we need more police enforcement to penalize those communities. So there is very much a difference in how these drug crises are racialized. Okay, so we're going to move into elite deviance now. As we go through, I wanted to just make you think about, as we talk about this, do you see it as more of a white-collar crime or as a gang activity? And so here are some definitions. White-collar crime are any crimes that are committed by non-physical means to avoid payment or loss of money or to obtain business or personal gain, where success depends on some kind of conceit or fraud. So this could be anywhere from me stealing post-it notes from the university or embezzlement or identity theft, to, the BP oil spill or anything that is like anything from a small to a large crime, as long as it is non-physical and a means to get advantage or avoid losses. Gang activity is defined by the DOJ and DHS as associations of three or more criminals, members who identify themselves by some identity, either a name, slogan, sign, or symbol, and whose purpose through criminal activity is to enhance or preserve an association's power, reputation, or economic resources. So as we talk about elite deviance, it is technically considered kind of a egregious form of white-collar crime, but sometimes it falls into more of a category of gang work, and I'm curious to see, as you read through this and think about it, where does it fall? So who are the elite? In the mid-1900s, C. Wright Mills defined the power elite as the intersection between the military, political, and corporate elites. So he saw a lot of overlap, that many of the military were getting into political office, people in political office were getting into corporations, and that there was a lot of exchanges of power in between these. We found that David Simon, who wrote the book on elite deviance, finds that the largest 500 or so manufacturing firms and some 50 financial institutions control 2/3 of all business income and half of the nation's bank deposits. This means they're controlled by less than 0.5% of the population. Half of all assets in the US right now are controlled by only 4,500 people. And this gets even more extreme when you go to the world, because of the ever more increasing inequality on the world scale. To define elite deviance differently than white-collar crimes, because he sees it as something much different, David Simon gives these characteristics: that it's committed by people in the highest strata of society, furthers the goals of the economic and political organizations, has little risk to it, meaning that they are unlikely to get caught, and it poses a great danger to the public in one of three ways. There's physical, financial, or moral. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be criminal. There are many things that these elite companies or people do that are technically legal, but that are not, that provide some mass harm to the public that outweighs any potential good. So we're going to go through 4 examples and watch some videos. First are the banana wars. Let us watch.
On a December night in 1910, the exiled former leader of Honduras, Manuel Bonilla, boarded a borrowed yacht in New Orleans. With a group of heavily armed accomplices, he set sail for Honduras in hopes of reclaiming power by whatever means necessary. Bonilla had a powerful backer, the future leader of a notorious organization known throughout Latin America as El Pulpo, or the Octopus, for its long reach. The infamous El Pulpo was a U.S. corporation trafficking in, of all things, bananas. It was officially known as United Fruit Company, or Chiquita Brands International, today. First cultivated in Southeast Asia thousands of years ago, bananas reached the Americas in the early 1500s, where enslaved Africans cultivated them in plots alongside sugar plantations. There were many different bananas, most of which looked nothing like the bananas in supermarket aisles today. In the 1800s, captains from New Orleans and New England ventured to the Caribbean in search of coconuts and other goods. They began to experiment with bananas, purchasing one kind, called Gros Michel, from Afro-Caribbean farmers in Jamaica, Cuba, and Honduras. Gros Michel bananas produced large bunches of relatively thick-skinned fruit, ideal for shipping. By the end of the 1800s, bananas were a hit in the US. They were affordable, available year-round, and endorsed by medical doctors. As bananas became big business, US fruit companies wanted to grow their own bananas. In order to secure access to land, banana moguls lobbied and bribed government officials in Central America and even funded coups to ensure they had allies in power. In Honduras, Manuel Bonilla repaid the banana man who had financed his return to power with land concessions. By the 1930s, one company dominated the region, United Fruit, who owned over 40% of Guatemala's arable land at one point. They cleared rainforest in Costa Rica, Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras, and Panama to build plantations, along with railroads, ports, and towns to house workers. Lured by relatively high-paying jobs, people migrated to banana zones. From Guatemala to Colombia, United Fruit's plantations grew exclusively Gros Michel bananas. These densely packed farms had little biological diversity, making them ripe for disease epidemics. The infrastructure connecting these vulnerable farms could quickly spread disease. Pathogens could hitch a ride from one farm to another on workers' boots, railroad cars, and steamships. That's exactly what happened in the 1910s, when a fungus began to level Gros Michel banana plantations, first in Panama and later throughout Central America, spreading quickly via the same system that had enabled big profits and cheap bananas. In a race against Panama disease, banana companies abandoned infected plantations in Costa Rica, Honduras, and Guatemala, leaving thousands of farmers and workers jobless. The companies then felled extensive tracts of rainforests in order to establish new plantations. After World War II, the dictatorships with which United Fruit had partnered in Guatemala and Honduras yielded to democratically elected governments that called for land reform. In Guatemala, President Jacobo Arbenz tried to buy back land from United Fruit and redistribute it to landless farmers. The Arbenz government offered to pay a price based on tax records, where United Fruit had underreported the value of the land. El Pulpo was not happy. The company launched propaganda campaigns against Arbenz and called on its deep connections in the US government for help. Citing fears of communism, the CIA orchestrated the overthrow of the democratically elected Arbenz in 1954. That same year, in Honduras, thousands of United Fruit workers went on strike until the company agreed to recognize a new labor union. With the political and economic costs of running from Panama disease escalating, United Fruit finally switched from Gros Michel to Panama disease-resistant Cavendish bananas in the early 1960s. Today, bananas are no longer as economically vital in Central America, and United Fruit Company, rechristened Chiquita, has lost its stranglehold on Latin American politics. But the modern banana industry isn't without problems. Cavendish bananas require frequent applications of pesticides that create hazards for farm workers and ecosystems. And though they're resistant to the particular pathogen that affected Gros Michel bananas, Cavendish farms also lack biological diversity, leaving the banana trade ripe for another pandemic. You've probably noticed that when you're...
Okay, so we see here how the interests and connection between the power elite. So we have the political, the corporate, and the military. where the United States and its military helped a gigantic corporation, the United Fruit Company, take over land, destabilize governments in order to ensure their own corporate profits. As you see on the left, the United States invaded Honduras 7 times between 1903 and 1925 at the behest of um, foreign companies, hoping for a stronger takeover of the economy and resources in Latin America. Um, so in this piece that I have linked here, capital and money were siphoned away from the local people, and there's a lack of economic development that is being felt all through Latin America. There's a lot of antagonism towards the US and the US interests. And so we can see all three of the harms described by David Simon and Elite Deviance. There is physical harm in the wars and in the diseases and in the treatment of the workers. There is economic and financial harm in the destruction of the rainforests, the taking over of other land and not giving it back. And there is moral harm in the distrust and antagonism towards the US, and has created a lot of really hard feelings. A lot of scholars also point to this era of destabilizing Latin America to the current issues that we have with immigration. That, if we had all these American companies go in, destabilize governments, take over economic areas, make it really hard for development. And so where do these people come when they need jobs or need subsistence? They come to where that resource was taken, which is the US. So this is a prime example of elite deviance at a massive, massive scale. We're talking about multiple countries, billions, if not more, of dollars, and a lot of lives lost over the fight for corporate power. The second example that we're going to look at are the wildfires in California. I will, instead of make you watch this with me, I will let you watch this video on your own. But the Camp Wildfire occurred in 2018. It completely decimated and destroyed the town of Paradise. It is no longer inhabitable. The water systems were contaminated. 85 people died. 19,000 buildings were destroyed, and the entire town was displaced. A report in 2019 said that at least 1,000 people were still looking for homes and were homeless. And this was because of a utility company called PG&E. PG&E distributes electricity throughout California. It's one of their utility companies for electricity. The CEO of PG&E pled guilty to, I think, around 87 counts of criminal activity leading up to this fire. However, it wasn't the first nor the last time PG&E created a catastrophe. So I'm going to read a couple of things. You can find them in the notes on the PowerPoint when I upload it. But from 1952 to 1966, PG&E dumped roughly 370 million gallons of chromium-6 tainted wastewater into unlined wastewater spreading ponds around the town of Hinckley, California, which infected their water system. In 1994, PG&E caused the Trauner Fire in Nevada County, California, and were found guilty of 739 counts of criminal negligence. In 1996, one of their substations in San Francisco caught fire. They were found culpable due to criminal negligence. In 1999, they were responsible for the Pendola Fire in Tahoe National Forest, burning nearly 12,000 acres. Again, they were found criminally negligent. PG&E has been found of criminal negligence in the San Francisco fire in 2003, the Sims and Fred's fire in 2004, explosions in electrical fires in San Francisco in 2005, a 2008 Rancho Cordova gas explosion, 2010 San Bruno pipeline explosion, 2014 Carmel gas explosion, 2015 Butte fire, 2018 Camp Fire, which I just talked about, and more. About 40 of wildfires in PG&E service area were caused directly by PG&E between 2017 and 2018. Now, after the Camp wildfire, it immediately faced about $30 billion of damages and immediately filed for bankruptcy protections, which meant that it allowed the courts and the judicial system to take over their finances and distribute them. And what happened was first, PG&E settled with California for about $1 billion. Then the next claimant that got payment were insurance and hedge fund companies, and PG&E paid about $11 billion to them. This is before any survivor or family of victims were paid by the company for its even they pleaded guilty, so they accepted responsibility. Yet the first people who received any compensation was the government and insurance and hedge fund companies. Then PG&E proposed a settlement as it was going reorganization through its bankruptcy for all the wildfire claims, including this fire, the Tubbs fire, the Butte fire, a ghost ship fire, and more. Through this, they only proposed around $13.5 billion for all of these fires and for all of the damage that they caused and for the people that were killed as it. And instead of even just $13 billion in funds, the settlement plan was that half of this money would come as stock shares in their own company. And so again, this is another gross example of elite deviance. While this doesn't involve the military, it does involve the connection between state and local governments, which provided PG&E the contracts to run electricity through the state and other, contracts of energy since the 1950s, and they have a long history of polluting or causing natural disasters that have heavy tolls on life in the area. And yet they are still working, they are still a company, and they still run a lot of the electricity. Today, if you've heard of the rolling blackouts in California, that is because PG&E cannot meet the demands of the energy for California without a fear of causing more wildfires, and so it periodically turns off the energy to cool down and reduce overloads of its electricity network. So it still is causing a lot of problems and a lot of issues. Example 3 is PPP. So PPP during COVID was the Paycheck Protection Program, which was designed to provide incentives for small businesses to keep their workers on payroll. They could use it for a number of things, and the way this worked was the federal government gave this money to banks, and then banks would distribute it to these small businesses. How is this an example of elite deviance? Well, more than half of the money from this fund went to just 5% of the recipients. So 5% of everyone who applied and received money, they were able to get more than half of the amount. And this included 600 large companies and dozens of national chains, even though this was meant for a small business venture. We have a lot of reporting on this. 1% of PPP borrowers got over 1/4 of the money. And so these were beneficiaries of more than $500 billion in taxpayer funds, dozens of public companies keeping millions of dollars in small business loans, celebrities receiving at least $3.7 million from PPP loans, congressional members, at least 12 of them, receiving PPP loans. And it's just astounding. at the amount of money that is being retained by these large corporations, even though they were meant for um, smaller groups. And finally, during the pandemic, the average net wealth of US billionaires increased by 70.3%. Elon Musk became the wealthiest man in the world, eclipsing Jeff Bezos because during the pandemic, he somehow grew his wealth by 751%. And reporting has shown that during this time, a new billionaire was minted every 26 hours, as inequality contributes to the death of one person every 4 seconds. And that 99% of humanity saw its income or wealth decrease, while the billionaires saw their fortunes rise dramatically, like to an unfathomable level. I mean, we can think about Elon Musk had only $24.6 billion at the beginning of the pandemic, and while all of us struggled, he raised it to $209 billion. And the reason of this is example number 4, financialization. So, financialization, the ideal on the left side is that the finance sector is fairly small, and mostly what it does is it provides loans and interest payments and other, it provides a medium for money to be doled out to people who are going to use it for business ventures, research, for public projects, for starting a business up, and then it lends them money, they pay it back, and that's all the finance sector was initially supposed to be, was a way for money to move around for actual material gain or investment. However, it has expanded to become the number one industry in the US and holds in the finance sector about 85% of the US economy. It's just money being moved around the finance sector and is not being returned to the production economy, to the government, or to individuals. It is just staying there, expanding on itself rather than being reintroduced into the economy that we buy and sell in. So if you think about this, if you run a software company and you make about $50 billion, where might you put that money? You could put it in a rainy day savings fund. You could increase the wages or packages and benefits of your employees. You could spend it on research and development for your firm. You could expand your firm. However, what we see is people are just putting it into the finance sector through buybacks. And here is a quick 1-minute video about that.
When a company generates profits, it can do a variety of things with the extra money. A sustainable business might divide its earnings among these priorities. But today, many American companies go a different route. They buy back their own stock on the open market, reducing the overall supply, which artificially inflates stock prices. Stock buybacks used to be viewed as market manipulation and were illegal prior to 1982. But buybacks by America's largest public companies have exploded in recent years. They exacerbate wealth inequality because the gains that result from the practice are concentrated among the already wealthy. As Rana Foroohar wrote, they promote a hoarding of corporate value within the financial system itself. Buybacks are in most cases the very definition of financialization. But we can fight back.
So this is a large part in how companies operate today, is that the corporate leaders will just put money back into the finance sector, hope that it increases, and when it does increase, they put it back. And they keep on this process that continues garnering wealth, but it remains within this finance sector. And that's why you see when you see like the GDP is hitting its newest high, and yet wages haven't increased, the average American's purchasing power hasn't increased. This is why, is because it's still in this finance sector, and it's not being used for any productive purpose in terms of making people's lives better. It's not being used for investing in communities. It's not being used for research and development of new technologies or drugs or medicines or, you know, providing new schools or equipment. It's just being hoarded in this sphere that is not productive for human life. And so thinking of this, we're going to end with, how does elite deviance contribute to inequality? We've talked about physical harms, financial harms, moral harms, and how these affect the opportunities, resources, and rewards and outcomes of everyone in the world because of these issues. And now thinking back to, is it white-collar crime or is it a gang, right? White-collar crime was defined simply as the nonviolent means of either avoiding loss or achieving some kind of gain through guile or conceit, whereas the gang was an association of 3 or more people that have some kind of connected language or symbol. We could think of a corporate logo, and that pursue criminal activity for increased power and profit. And that to me seems a more apt definition, but still not quite the same, because, you know, there is a large difference between a gang of young kids in inner city Chicago and the United Fruit Company that toppled governments in Latin America. So this is the end of this week. I know it went a little long, but there was a lot to kind of discuss and cover, and there could be infinite more to discuss. And if you have questions, please let me know, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. We'll talk next week.